Theranos didn't fool stupid people. It fooled the smartest investors in the world. We're talking about people with decades of experience, billion-dollar track records, and access to the best information money can buy. Former US Secretaries of State, top-tier venture capitalists, billionaire families, the kind of people who are supposed to see through hype, spot risk, and make calculated decisions. And yet, they all bought in. At its peak, Theranos was valued at over $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes, its founder, was hailed as the next Steve Jobs, a visionary who was about to revolutionize healthcare. The promise? A device that could run hundreds of blood tests using just a single drop of blood. No needles, no labs, fast, cheap, and accessible testing for everyone. It sounded like magic, and more importantly, it sounded like the future. Investors poured in hundreds of millions of dollars. Major partnerships were announced. The media couldn't get enough of the story. Every piece of coverage reinforced the same narrative. This was a once-in-a-generation breakthrough. And the people backing it made it even more convincing. Because when you see names like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and powerful Silicon Valley insiders attached to a company, you don't assume something is wrong. You assume they've done the homework. You assume the technology works. You assume this is real. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. Behind the headlines, behind the billion-dollar valuation, behind the carefully crafted image of innovation, Theranos didn't actually have a working product. The device that was supposed to change medicine didn't reliably work. The tests weren't accurate, and in many cases, the results were being run on traditional machines behind the scenes, not on the revolutionary technology investors were being sold. So how does something like this happen? How does a company with no proven technology convince some of the most powerful and experienced people in the world to invest billions of dollars? Because this wasn't just a lucky guess. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was something much more calculated. A story so convincing that even the smartest people in the room stopped asking the most important question: what if it's not real? To understand how Theranos pulled this off, you have to understand the environment it was operating in. Because this didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in Silicon Valley, a place where bold ideas are currency and belief can be just as valuable as reality. In Silicon Valley, startups aren't built on what they are today, they're built on what they could become. Founders don't sell products, they sell visions. And investors aren't just betting on current performance, they're betting on the future. Sometimes a very distant, very uncertain future. There's even a phrase that captures this mindset perfectly. Fake it till you make it. In many cases, it's not even considered dishonest. It's seen as part of the process. You build a prototype that barely works, you pitch it as revolutionary, you raise money, and then you figure out how to actually make it real later. And to be fair, sometimes it works. Some of the biggest companies in the world started with incomplete products, bold promises, and a lot of belief. So the line between visionary and delusional can get very blurry. Now add one more ingredient to this environment: competition. Because in Silicon Valley, every investor is looking for the next Apple, the next Google, the next billion-dollar breakthrough. And that creates pressure. Pressure to move fast, pressure to invest early, pressure to not miss out. Because missing the next big thing isn't just a lost opportunity, it's a career-defining mistake. And that fear has a name: FOMO, fear of missing out. When a startup starts gaining attention, when big names begin to show interest, when the media starts calling it the future, that fear spreads quickly. Investors begin to think, what do they know that I don't? If everyone else is getting in, maybe I should too. And slowly, skepticism gets replaced by momentum. Questions get softer. due diligence gets lighter because nobody wants to be the one person who said no to the next billion-dollar company. And this is where things become dangerous. Because in a system like this, where hype is rewarded, speed is valued, and missing out is feared, stories can become more powerful than facts. Narratives can outweigh evidence, and belief can override skepticism. Theranos didn't just exploit individual investors, it exploited the system itself. A system that by design encourages optimism, amplifies hype, and sometimes quietly rewards people for believing things that aren't fully real yet. And when you combine that with the right story, the right timing, and the right people, even the smartest investors in the world can start to believe. So how did Theranos actually pull this off? Because this wasn't just hype or blind optimism. There was a system, a repeatable playbook that turned something that barely worked into something that looked revolutionary. It started with the promise, a single drop of blood and hundreds of tests. No needles, no vials, no waiting days for lab results. Just a tiny finger prick, and within minutes, you could supposedly get everything from basic cholesterol levels to complex disease diagnostics. It sounded impossible, but that was exactly why it worked. Because the bigger the promise, the more attention it captured. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a medical breakthrough, a once-in-a-generation innovation. And once investors believed that, they stopped asking whether it worked and started focusing on how big it could become. Then came the secrecy. Theranos operated behind a wall of extreme confidentiality. Employees were split into isolated teams, each one working on a small piece of the system without seeing the full picture. Information was tightly controlled, even internally. From the outside, this looked like cutting-edge innovation. In reality, it prevented transparency, because when nobody sees the full system, nobody can fully question it. Investors were told the technology was too advanced and too sensitive to reveal, and in Silicon Valley, that kind of secrecy doesn't raise alarms. It creates intrigue. It makes people assume there's something valuable hidden underneath. So instead of demanding proof, they accepted the mystery. Next came the demonstrations. This is where the illusion became real. Theranos would invite investors, partners, and executives to see the technology in action. Devices would light up, screens would display results. Everything appeared smooth, fast, and futuristic. But behind the scenes, the machines often weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. In many cases, the actual blood tests were being run on traditional laboratory equipment, the same machines used by every other company in the industry, not on Theranos' proprietary device. The revolutionary technology wasn't producing reliable results, but the illusion was. And that's what investors were really seeing. A story that looked real enough to believe, a product that looked functional enough to trust, a future that felt close enough to invest in. Step by step, promise by promise, demo by demo, Theranos built a version of reality that didn't actually exist. Because in the end, they weren't selling a working technology. They were selling something much more powerful. They were selling the illusion of one. But the technology alone isn't what convinced people. Because if this was just about a product, Theranos would have collapsed much earlier. What made it work was something far more powerful: psychology. Elizabeth Holmes didn't just build a company, she built a persona, a carefully crafted image of a visionary founder. She dressed like Steve Jobs, black turtleneck, minimalist style, calm, controlled presence. Every detail was intentional. It signaled one thing: this is the next generational genius. And people believed it. Because in Silicon Valley, the story of a young, unconventional founder changing the world isn't unusual, it's expected. Jobs, Zuckerberg, Gates, the pattern was already there. Holmes didn't need to prove she was one of them. She just needed to look like it. But image alone isn't enough to convince billionaires and world leaders, so she added something else: authority. Theranos built one of the most powerful boards of directors in Silicon Valley history. Not scientists, not medical experts, but influential figures, former secretaries of state, military leaders, high-ranking politicians, people with reputations, people with credibility, people who on paper had nothing to do with blood testing, but everything to do with trust. And that was the point. Because when investors saw names like Henry Kissinger or George Shultz attached to the company, they didn't question the science. They assumed it had already been vetted. They assumed someone else had done the hard work. This is called social proof. If enough important people believe something, it must be true. And the higher the status of those people, the stronger that belief becomes. Then came the pressure. Because once a few big names were involved, others didn't want to be left out. Meetings became less about skepticism and more about access. Investors weren't asking, does this work? They were asking, can I still get in? And that shift is critical, because when fear of missing out replaces critical thinking, the entire dynamic changes. Doubt becomes risky. Skepticism feels like hesitation, and hesitation in a fast-moving environment like Silicon Valley can cost you everything. So people followed, not because they were foolish, but because everything around them signaled that this was real. The founder looked credible, the board looked powerful, the story made sense, and everyone else was already in. So it must be true, right? That's the illusion. Because when enough smart people believe something, it doesn't make it real. It just makes it harder to question. For years, the illusion held. The story was too good, the people involved were too powerful, and the promise was too big to question. Until someone finally did. In 2015, a journalist named John Carreyrou from the Wall Street Journal started digging into Theranos. At first, it didn't look like much. Just another Silicon Valley success story. But the deeper he went, the more things didn't add up. Sources inside the company began to speak. Employees described machines that didn't work, tests that failed, data that was inconsistent or outright unreliable. And most importantly, they revealed that Theranos wasn't using its own technology for the majority of its tests. They were using standard lab equipment. The very thing they claimed to replace. When the first article was published, it hit like a shockwave, because suddenly the story started to crack. Theranos denied everything. They pushed back aggressively. Lawyers got involved. Statements were released. Elizabeth Holmes went on TV and confidently dismissed the claims. But this time, it didn't work, because once doubt enters the system, it spreads. Partners started asking questions, and one of the biggest was Walgreens. Walgreens had already rolled out Theranos testing centers in stores across the country. Real customers, real patients, real diagnoses. Now they were faced with a terrifying possibility. What if the results weren't accurate? What if people had been making medical decisions based on faulty data? That's when the pressure became impossible to ignore. Investigations expanded, regulators stepped in, and piece by piece, the entire structure started collapsing. Walgreens cut ties, investors backed away, the media turned. What was once seen as the future of healthcare was now being exposed as something else entirely. Because this wasn't just a failed startup. Failed startups happen all the time. This was different. This was a company that raised billions of dollars, partnered with major institutions, and built its reputation on a technology that didn't work as promised. And the consequences weren't just financial. Investors lost massive amounts of money. But more importantly, patients received inaccurate blood test results. People who thought they were healthy might not have been. People who thought something was wrong might have panicked for no reason. This wasn't just about hype anymore. This was about real-world impact, real decisions, real lives. And at that point, the narrative completely changed. Because once real harm enters the picture, this is no longer a startup story. It becomes something much darker. It becomes deception with consequences. The story of Theranos feels extreme. A billion-dollar company built on a technology that didn't work. Some of the smartest investors in the world completely fooled. Real consequences affecting real people. It sounds like an exception. But it's not. Because the real lesson of Theranos isn't about one company. It's about a pattern that didn't disappear. It evolved. Today, we're seeing a new wave of companies built on something just as powerful as the promise of revolutionizing blood testing: artificial intelligence. Everywhere you look, there are startups claiming they're about to change everything: automate entire industries, replace human labor, unlock unlimited productivity. And just like before, the stories are compelling. The demos look impressive. The valuations are skyrocketing. But underneath the surface, the same question still exists. How much of this is real, and how much of it is narrative? Because hype moves faster than truth. It always has. Investors aren't just analyzing products, they're chasing the next big thing, the next Apple, the next Google, the next company that defines a generation. And in that race, something dangerous happens. The story starts to matter more than the substance. Founders learn how to pitch vision instead of reality. Companies learn how to showcase potential instead of proof. And investors learn how to believe before they verify. Not because they're irrational, but because the cost of missing out feels higher than the cost of being wrong. That's the same force that powered Theranos, and it's still here. Because at the end of the day, markets don't run purely on data. They run on belief, on narratives, on stories that feel true even when they aren't fully proven yet. And the more convincing the story, the easier it is to ignore the cracks. So when you look at the next big startup, the next revolutionary technology, the next company everyone is talking about, ask yourself one simple question. Are you investing in something real, or are you investing in something that just sounds real? Because history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And the next Theranos won't look like Theranos. It will look like the future. And that's exactly why people will believe it.